Boa tarde, pessoal. Hoje nós temos a satisfação de receber o professor Yannis Dafermos, da Universidade de Londres, do Departamento de Economia. Ele vai falar sobre a questão da transição climática justa de um sistema financeiro towards a climate just financial system. Ele é economista de formação, com mestrado e doutorado em economia na Grécia, em Atenas, e atualmente professor em Londres, trabalhando com macroeconomia, sistema financeiro, sistema mudanças climáticas e o sistema financeiro. E para comentar, o professor Marco Aurélio Croco. I'll just giving a brief introduction of yourself, Yannis, just telling our students here and lectures here your background and what you're going to talk about. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us here today, and I'll give you the floor for your presentation, and then Professor Marco Aurélio Croco will make some comments and we start some discussion. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, and many thanks to Juliana for the invitation, and thanks to you for the introduction. So it's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to give this presentation. I'm going to talk about the links between climate finance and climate justice. I will start by saying a few things about how things have been evolved over the last years or so in terms of climate finance, and then I will try to explain what is the problems from my perspective in terms of the way that climate finance has evolved. I will try to make some proposals about how we can make climate finance more aligned with climate justice. So let me start by saying that over the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen significant changes in the financial world. I mean, we have that many central banks around the world, including BCB, the central bank in Brazil, but of course also central banks in Europe, central banks in Southeast Asia, have tried to incorporate climate issues into the way that they think about the economy, but also in some of their monetary policy tools. We have seen a lot of central banks trying to develop what has been called climate stress testing, whereby they analyze how the financial system might be exposed to climate risks. In Europe, we have seen that the European Central Bank at some point decided to stop investing in carbon-intensive bonds. So in their key programs, in the corporate key program, they made some adjustments in order to make sure that they would stop supporting fossil fuel companies through the purchases of bonds. And we have also seen a lot of initiatives from central banks and financial supervisors about understanding how they can make the financial system less fragile from a climate perspective. We have seen many initiatives about developing sustainable finance taxonomy. So there's a lot of work on this area right now. At the same time, we have seen, of course, the huge increase in the popularity of the so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Many private banks now use ESG as a kind of indicator for making decisions about investment. Shareholders have paid more attention to ESG. There's a big debate about how big banks like BlackRock analyze ESG, of course, but ESG is part of the new reality in finance. We also have a lot of credit rating agencies that have started incorporated climate into their analysis of credit risks. And I think we're going to see much more in the coming years because the models that they use for analyzing climate risks are still at the initial stage, but it seems that climate risk will become a very significant part of how credit rating agencies evaluate companies and evaluate countries. And of course, in development banking, we also have some interesting changes because now there are several development banks that have targets about supporting the green economy. And my expectation is that this is going to become a more important part of their strategy in the coming years. Now, I think this is very interesting, the fact that we have now that climate is part of the discussions in finance, is part of many financial policies and strategies. I remember when I started working on this area about 8-9 years ago, there was no interest in the links between climate change and finance. Now there's so many things that are happening. So I think it's good that we have that. However, from my perspective, a very significant limitation of all these climate-related financial initiatives is that they do not take into account global climate justice. And when I refer to global climate justice, I refer to the fact that, as it is very much well documented, the countries in the global north have generated the majority of emissions that are responsible for climate change. Now it is very well known that climate change is driven by cumulative emissions, by the emissions that we generate throughout time. And most of these emissions have been generated by countries like the UK, the US, several countries in the EU. But despite the fact that the majority of emissions come from these countries, the damages from climate change, the climate-related events, are much more important in the global south compared to the global north. And this means that there is a kind of a justice problem, because the responsibility rests with the global north, but the effects are more important in the global south. And there is a lot of recent evidence that documents this climate injustice. We know, for instance, that small island developing states are extremely vulnerable to climate change, but of course they have a very small contribution to the problem. And if you look at indices about climate vulnerability, the vast majority of countries that are considered to be climate vulnerable are countries in the global south. So the literature on climate finance has not focused on that, and the policymakers that work on climate finance have not focused on the issue of global injustice. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is first to explain why climate finance not only does not take into account justice issues, but it can also make things worse. So I'm going to explain how climate finance exacerbates global injustice, and I'm going to present specific ways through which this is happening. And after that, I'm going to make some broad recommendations about the key pillars that we need, in my view, to introduce into the financial system in order to make this more in line with global justice. But of course, what I'm going to say, some of my suggestions might be pragmatic, some suggestions might be a little bit more challenging from a political perspective. So in the third section of my presentation, I will talk a little bit about some challenges that we might face if we try to introduce climate justice into climate finance. So let me start with this table, where I have the three main channels through, in my opinion, climate finance now is making things worse from a global climate justice perspective. And let me first talk about the channel that I call exposing by self-protecting. And let me use a couple of examples in order to illustrate how this channel works. Now, I said before that there are many credit rating agencies that try to incorporate climate into their models. And based on this, they try to change the assessment that they make about the credibility of companies and governments. Now, I have seen some presentations from credit rating agencies, and what is a common element of these presentations is that those countries that are more vulnerable to climate change, those countries that are facing and are going to face more climate events, are those that are considered to be more risky from a financial perspective. So, for instance, if you think about Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries, and they have already experienced a lot of economic losses because of global warming, because of the sea level rise, because of flooding, because of other climate events. And this means that from the perspective of credit rating agencies, is not perhaps a good investment if some global investors buy public bonds issued by the government of Bangladesh. And if you look at the projections that they make, it's very clear that they expect that the risk, the financial risk of these countries is going to become worse in the coming years. So what does it mean? It means that it's very likely that they are going to downgrade countries based on the fact that they are climate vulnerable. Then it will become more difficult for these countries to find finance either from the bond market or from any other financial channel. And it will become more difficult for these countries to invest in adapting to climate, and the climate effects will become even worse. So we will have the creation of a vicious cycle whereby countries that are more exposed to climate change will lose access to cheap finance. This will make things more difficult for them. And at the end of the day, finance is going to make things worse because these countries will have high interest rates and they will lose access to financial markets. So by trying to protect the financial system from physical risks, the climate effects related to events like floods, hurricanes, typhoons, and so on, at the end of the day, what the financial system does is that it exposes these countries to higher risks. And this holds not only for governments, it can also be the case for companies or households, because the financial system does not want to provide money to those that are exposed to climate risks. And this means that it will make more difficult for these people to get access to finance. So this is the first channel, and we haven't seen that so much so far, but my expectation is that it will become a very significant channel in the coming years. The second one, I call it decarbonizing by exploiting. It's how exactly the countries in developed economies think about reducing their emissions. And what happens right now is that there are a lot of financial initiatives that try to convince companies to reduce their emissions. Now, if you think about a big multinational company in the UK or in the US, when they try to reduce their emissions, one way is for them to try to rely on renewables, right? But if they rely on renewables, let's say if they develop some batteries or if they need to use solar panels, they also need to use more materials. Many of these materials are in countries in the global south. And I'm talking about copper, lithium, these types of materials. So we know that the vast majority of lithium in the world is in Latin America. We know that there's a lot of copper in countries in in Africa. And the problem is that there is now a very high risk that the investment in renewables will happen at the expense of those in the global south that have these materials, because the multinational companies want to make sure that these materials will be available at low prices. So this makes it more possible that there will be some exploitation of labor in order to make sure that the cost will be low. And it also makes it very likely that they will not pay attention to the environmental implications of material extraction. So this is one thing that we have to consider, how exactly companies engage with the extraction of materials. The second one is about large-scale renewable projects. So many companies and countries in the global south think about the fact that there is not enough land to build, let's say, very big wind farms or very big areas whereby we have solar panels. And they look at the global south and they think that there is a lot of space there. And we have a lot of projects recently whereby the idea is to go to the global south, perhaps change the use of land, create some deforestation in order to build some big green projects and generate energy. But this means that it will create a lot of problems to the global population, because in many cases people will be asked to live where they live. They will be asked perhaps to stop using the forest as before. And this means that this will create some very significant side effects in the Global South. And finally, we have the so-called carbon offsets. Carbon offsets refer to this idea whereby you continue to generate emissions, but you pay some money in order for some emissions to be reduced in another part of the world. So, for instance, we have that some fossil fuel companies basically set targets about net emissions, and based on these targets, they will continue to generate emissions, but they will try to compensate that by paying for carbon offsets, whereby the idea will be for someone else to use this money to perhaps build some trees and plant some trees, and then create more forests somewhere in the world. Or they might use this money from carbon offsets in order to protect areas from deforestation. But again, the problem with that is that, as we have seen in the past with carbon offset projects, they do not respect the rights of indigenous people and the rights of the local population in general. Because by trying to pay them not to use their land, has a lot of negative side effects for the way that they live. So when I'm saying that the Global North is trying to decarbonize by exploiting, I'm referring to these cases, and the broad term that can be used in order to explain this is green extractivism, which refers to the fact that at the end of the day, what the Global North tries to do is to green the economies by using extractivist practices. And the problem is that then the global injustices are exacerbated, despite the fact that the target is to reduce emissions. So this is a second channel. What is the role of finance in that? Finance now is supporting companies that try to reduce emissions, and finance can support projects that at the end of the day create more green extractivism. So by having these incentives to reduce emissions and without having any other conditionalities, we end up with a situation whereby big companies and governments exploit resources in the Global South. And the third channel that I would like to discuss is the so-called Wall Street Consensus. The Wall Street Consensus is considered to be the current status quo in World Bank, IMF, and all these institutions, whereby the idea is to maximize finance for development by using the so-called de-risking. So de-risking refers to this idea whereby governments that don't have enough financial resources use regulation, they deregulate for specific investors, they provide some subsidies, they provide a friendly environment to investors in order to convince them to put their money in a climate project in the Global South. So what is happening is that many governments just try to convince some private investors and private banks to put money into projects because the governments don't have the capacity to do so. And we have seen several climate private-public partnerships whereby the financial sector provides finance and the government basically promises high returns and low risks. And the problem with that is that it distracts our attention from developing more systemic approaches to dealing with the climate challenges. So governments spend a lot of time to convince specific investors without thinking about how to create a system whereby climate mitigation and climate adaptation projects fit in together. And the other problem is that in many cases, the projects are not successful, and then governments need to step in and basically cover any losses, in which case we have that public debt increases. So although the idea behind the Wall Street Consensus is not to create more public debt, if things don't work, the government sector guarantees the returns on investors, and therefore it has to step in and provide financial support. So this can also create some injustices in the sense that private banks don't lose from that, but governments in the Global South might see financial losses. So these are three ways through which the current climate finance initiatives create perhaps more problems than the ones that they try to solve. And all these things have not been taken into account in the standard discussions that we have about climate finance. So one question is, how can we address that? And I'm going to talk about first how to avoid these side effects that I've just mentioned, but also how to change climate finance in order to incorporate global climate justice much more explicitly. And in order to explain the first pillar, which is related to the principle of differentiated responsibilities that we have between the global north and the global south, it's important to make this distinction between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So climate mitigation refers to any type of project that tries to reduce emissions. So it tries to change how much we generate emissions right now in order to avoid climate problems. And climate mitigation tools in the context of finance means any type of financial policy that tries to reduce the availability of finance for carbon-intensive activities and tries to increase the support from a financial perspective for projects that try to reduce emissions. This is mitigation. It's about reducing emissions. How about climate adaptation? Climate adaptation is about any type of tool or policy that helps communities, companies, economies in general to adjust to the new reality of climate change. So when we build defenses for floods, we try to protect people from water. When we have what is called climate smart agriculture, we try to find better ways to generate, to produce food without having so much reliance on water. Or when we build properties that do not rely so much on water compared to what is the case right now, and they are more energy efficient. I mean, we try to make them less reliance on things that might be affected by climate change. So by having climate adaptation, we are able to deal with the fact that global warming is with us, is going to become worse, and crucially, is more important for the global south, because adaptation is extremely important for countries in the global south, since the effects are much more significant there. Now, if we turn to finance, there are many different tools that have been used in order to support climate projects, or many ideas about how we can use tools to support climate adaptation or mitigation. So we have seen policies whereby public banks have specific targets about green loans. There are development banks like the European Investment Bank that, for instance, has tried to reduce the loans that it provides to the fossil fuel sector. And then we have key programs. I said before that the ECB, the European Central Bank, has introduced climate criteria into their key program. We have credit guidance, and this can also include policies related to credit that is provided to the agricultural sector, where we can have policies according to which credit is not provided as long as there is a contribution of a company to deforestation. And we also have cases in which central banks can provide loans to banks depending on how much these banks support the green economy or climate adaptation. So there are different types of tools, and happy to talk more about this if you have specific questions. But from my perspective, if we want to talk about climate justice, what is very important is to use these tools in different ways in Brazil, in Kenya, or Bangladesh compared to what is the case in the UK or Germany. Why? Because one size doesn't fit all. When we look at making adjustments to the financial system in order to support climate targets, we need to take into account that financial systems are different. We need to take into account that the responsibility for reducing emissions primarily rests with the global north, where it's easier to make these reductions, and it's morally correct for the global north to do most of the reductions. And when it comes to the global south, it is necessary to think about how financial policies can support those people that are suffering from climate change. So we need to think how we can support people in the agricultural sector that now face more droughts. We need to think about how we can create cities that are not so much vulnerable to floods. And this requires some investment. And finance needs to support this climate adaptation investment much more than what is the case in the global north. So the first pillar of a climate just financial system is that we have differentiated climate responsibilities, and this needs to be reflected in the financial tools that we use to support climate projects. Now, the second pillar is to make the policies of global north financial institutions in line with climate justice, and in particular to make sure that the way that the global north is trying to decarbonize does not create green extractivist problems in the global south. Now, there are significant gaps there. Why? Because we don't have that in the current discussions about financing green activities. There is a collection of data about the supply chains of companies. There's no collection of data about how exactly companies use carbon offsets. And my argument is that we need to do that properly. We need to start doing that in a way that allows us to identify which companies perhaps contribute to green extractivism. And it's very important to introduce this as a conditionality into any financial support. And just to give you an example, the ECB recently, as I said before, introduced some climate criteria into their corporate bond purchase program, their corporate Q program, but they have supported many green companies, and some of them have engaged with some type of green extractivism, but we don't have data to evaluate this properly, so this was never considered to be a criterion when the program was designed. So we need to look at this carefully, because we don't want to have these side effects on the global south when the global north is trying to decarbonize. So this is a second pillar that we have to consider. And let me turn to the most challenging issue if we're going to develop a globally just financial system. And this is how to create some permanent climate justice financial mechanisms. And let me say very briefly a few things about what the problem is right now. This problem is also very much connected with the discussions that we are having in COP28 at the moment, this week and the previous week. So in 1992, there was an agreement that countries in the global north, developed countries, would provide some finance to the global south based on this principle of differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So this goes back to the early 1990s. But despite the fact that there was an agreement about this, there are three problems with climate finance from the global north to the global south. And these are, first, that this finance is very low. It never passed the threshold of $100 billion per year. The second problem is that most of this finance, as you can see in the graphs here, is basically about mitigation, not adaptation, but adaptation is the main challenge, as I said before, for the global south. And we also have this problem whereby most of this finance has been provided in the form of loans. What does it mean? It means that it has created more debt for the global south. So this means that what we have right now is not sufficient. And we also have to consider the three key facts that I have on the slide. First, we have a global financial architecture whereby governments and central banks in the global south are in a subordinate position because their currency is not as strong as the US or Euro. They don't have the capacity to spend in the same way as the global north. We saw that very clearly during COVID-19. The global north could create money and support government spending. The global south couldn't do that in the same way. the problem was much more significant in least developed countries, but also in the emerging countries, we had a lot of challenges with respect to that. So first, we have a global financial architecture that doesn't support the global south. Second, based on the cumulative emissions, there is a big literature in economics that shows that there's a climate debt to global south countries because global north has created all these emissions. So this debt has to be repaid somehow. Third fact is that losses and damages related to climate change, I'm referring to the economic effects of hurricanes or the economic effects of typhoons and floods and droughts. These are becoming every year more significant and more severe. And even if we manage to achieve a global warming that is not higher than 1.5 degrees, still we will have much more damages compared to what we have right now. And the expectation is that this will increase exponentially. So if we consider these three facts, we need to do something much more fundamental than what we have right now. And because of these challenges, there have been a lot of discussions recently and a lot of proposals about what might happen in order to support the financing of adaptation and losses and damages in the global south. People are talking about debt relief programs. We have this idea of debt for climate swaps, where countries can basically not repay debt as long as they use financial resources that would be used to repay debt in order to invest in the climate project. But of course, the investors have to agree with that. So there have been some agreements with investors about doing so. There are some suggestions about using the special drawing rights, which is a specific type of money that is related with IMF and was used also during the COVID-19 crisis. And there are also discussions about something more radical like climate reparations. And I think all these proposals are very interesting and they have their own benefits. From the perspective of climate justice, debt relief programs, debt for climate swaps, or even SDRs are not sufficient because they don't recognize that there is a kind of an obligation from the global north. It's not just to provide some support if there is an agreement. It's not just to have a small debt relief. It's not to give some incentives to do more, to invest more in climate. It's something much more fundamental that is not taken into account in the first two proposals. Climate reparations try to address the justice problem, but the idea is that there will be one-off payments, and this doesn't cover the fact that the losses in the coming years will be perhaps exponentially increasing. And climate reparations also need to rely on some taxes that have to be raised perhaps somewhere in the global north world, and this creates some political tensions. Now, you might have seen, I don't know how much you follow the COP28 discussions right now, but there was an agreement last week about the development of a loss and damage fund. It will be hosted by the World Bank, and this has already created a lot of tensions because many global south countries don't like the fact that the World Bank is going to be responsible for this. And the idea behind the fund is that some countries in the global north are going to collect some money. This money could be provided in the form of grants or cheap loans. And we already had some commitments from the UK, the EU, the US about the grants that they're going to provide in the coming months in order to support climate vulnerable countries. So this is a very interesting development. However, there is a limitation in this fund. One limitation is that there is no obligation for its countries to provide money through this fund. So everything is voluntary and there's no recognition of climate justice as a starting point. And this means that at the end of the day, we might not have enough spending in order to deal with the losses and damages. I mean, if you look at how much money it is expected to be required compared to what has been provided so far, many people say that it's only, it's much less than 1% of what is needed. So we are very far from having something with a solution to the problem. Now, what I would like to suggest, and this will be the last part of my suggestions, is to look at the problem from a principles perspective, and to understand what would be a kind of solution that would be consistent with climate justice. And my suggestion would be that if we take seriously climate justice, we need to develop something that is fundamentally very different from what we have right now. And my suggestion would be to create what I call a climate justice facility that uses the fact that at the top of the hierarchy of currencies, we have US, we have Europe, we have Australia, and these are countries that can create money whenever it is necessary to support the economy. And we have to use this property of money in order to support the global south. So this facility that I have in my mind is a facility that connects the central banks in the global north with the central banks in the global south. It allows countries in the global south that, for instance, face a significant climate event to apply for a loan to a climate justice facility. This loan, crucially, will be perpetual, so it will not be repaid, and ideally will be at zero or very low interest rate. Then the justice facility goes to the central banks in the global north, and depending on their contribution to cumulative emissions, they issue a part of the money that is necessary in order for this loan to be provided. As I said, it's very important, according to the second property that I have here, to provide and to allocate responsibilities based on cumulative emissions. This is in line with climate justice. And the interest rate should also be zero or very low in order to avoid creating more financial burden. And for those of you who like balance sheets, I have how this would look like from a balanced perspective. So the climate justice facility will be between the global north and the global south. So let's say that in Barbados, there is a climate event that leads to a lot of losses, and there's a need to provide financial support. They apply for getting a climate loan from the climate justice facility. So this will be on the liability side of the government of Barbados. And then what the climate justice facility does is that it asks from, let's say, the ECB, the Fed, the Bank of England, central banks in the global north, to create money in order to basically provide this loan. Okay, this is not very far from what these central banks did during the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 crisis in order to buy bonds and more, including government bonds. So they create money, they provide these loans. The climate justice facility collects these loans, it creates a pooled climate loan, and this is basically a liability for the government of Barbados, but also creates cash in the form of electronic deposits in order for Barbados to be able to spend on climate loss and damage projects. So what we have, and I know that this looks very radical and is very far from what we have right now in the global financial system, is that countries in the global north that have the power to create money without significant negative implications use this money in order to support the government of Barbados. And the pooled climate loan, as I said before, will be perpetual, so it will remain on the balance of Barbados, it will remain on the balance of the global north central banks, and will not be repaid. So it will not create additional financial burden at the end of the day. Let me highlight that, of course, this would be a kind of a complementary tool. It has the advantage that it creates money whenever we need it. This money will not be inflationary in the sense that it is going to be used in order to create reconstruction when we have climate events. It is going to be used in order to protect people from distractions that come from climate. It will also help to reduce the power of global private banks that right now use their ability to provide finance to governments in the global south in order to create more profits for them. And at the end of the day, if you know that there is kind of an automatic facility that works whenever there is a climate damage, credit rating agencies will also take this into account and will perhaps downgrade less countries that are more vulnerable to climate change. Of course, however, and let me turn to that. Of course, there will be a lot of political barriers to something like that. Okay, I'm not saying that this is politically feasible right now. Of course, something like that will not be very popular in the global north because central banks will say that they don't want to create money for the global south. The mandates of central banks will need to be adjusted in order to support something like that. Private banks will be very negative to having something like this because it would reduce their power. However, my view is that as we have seen with COP over the last 2 years, the climate crisis is becoming worse. Things are getting out of control, and now people are much more open to more fundamental changes. I mean, nobody would think that we would have a loss and damage fund in 2023 if you asked them 2 years ago. So as the climate crisis becomes worse, I think it's easier to think about something more radical as long as this can help us address the problem. And just to say that, of course, there are also a lot of technical barriers. We need to develop taxonomies of climate losses and damages. I think this is now happening because of the Loss and Damage Fund, but we need to make more progress on this. There are a lot of papers recently that try to allocate responsibilities in terms of cumulative emissions. So we have the data about that, but we need to work more on this. We need to think about how exactly climate loans are going to be used by governments. We need to introduce conditionalities. We don't want governments to use the money in any way that they think is best, for instance, including corruption. We need to find a structure, institutional structure that makes sure that these projects related to climate are supported properly. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done. I'm not saying that this is not challenging, but in order to conclude, I would like to highlight that, again, the fact that we are not taking into account global climate justice means that we have now a lot of climate finance initiatives that create a lot of problems to the global south. We should not ignore this. Second, we need to do a lot of research in order to understand how exactly this is happening. And this research should focus on capturing the current reality, but also to support from a technical perspective the creation of a climate just financial system, and also to analyze the political economy implications of the changes that I talked about before. And when I'm talking about climate justice, just to clarify that in this presentation, I focused only on global justice. I didn't talk about injustices related to workers, to women, or injustices related to race. So we also need to consider all this. My presentation was about global climate injustice. I think we also need to also think about other types of injustices and how climate finance should take them into account. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention. I very much look forward to the comments and later also to the questions from you. Thank you so much.
Hi, Yannis. Let me introduce myself. I will be the moderator of I am Marco Croco. I am the lecturer professor responsible for this discipline of the course. First of all, thank you very much to accept the invitation to be a part of this course, and this was transformed in one activity of our post-graduation course. So I will make some comments and some questions that I put to you. First of all, just one comment. I was outside the university the last 10 years. I was in the other side of the coin. I used to be a CEO of development bank. So I was indeed practicing the de-risking, although in that time I didn't know the name de-risking, and I didn't know because I stopped to study. And so now I see what I'm doing more better than before. And it is very interesting because I feel the power of the change between Wall Street consensus and the Washington consensus to the Wall Street consensus. I see this happening. I remember once in a meeting, annual meeting of the Latin America Association of Developed Banks, and I was in a table with someone from IDB and from OECD. And the point is, nowadays, after I return, I start to acknowledge the word of Wall Street consensus. I returned that point, 2016, something like that. And the presentation that they give to us is about the risk, only the risk. Developed banks do not have to supply loans. Developed bank that has to be a project bankable for the private sector. So it's very interesting, and congratulations for your approach, Yannis. I'm following your approach, Gabor, and the people from the critical microfinance. Critical microfinance is the one most interesting thing that happens in literature in the last years. So congratulations for your work. So the point is, and the most thing that interests me is about the power of the Wall Street consensus and the limitations of Wall Street consensus imposes for the transition for the green economy, or for the transition to supersede the climate crisis. Maybe I think that maybe they manage, but not on the time necessary to do that. The time necessary to avoid the heating of the world. So before I go to that, I ask one first question. Is there a justice in the old, before the climate crisis? Is there a financial system justice before the climate crisis? Or in the other way, the climate crisis increases the injustices that the previous development paradigm, the Washington consensus, the Wall Street consensus. So they increase, and if you can elaborate in that, it would be very good to understand, because I think it's what we're talking about is the possibilities of to achieve or to fix the climate change, to go for a economy or a world with low emissions, and the possibility that this will happen while you have the Wall Street consensus. This is the main point, because I believe what I'm seeing, that because the convention about green development is increasing the public and the politics and so on and so forth. But I don't know if they are increasing inside the main structure of the Wall Street consensus, which is the financial system and the central banks. For me, is they are together the most resistant part of the whole structure about that to manage to achieve the transition. So the main question, Yannis, do you think that will be possible to supersede the climate crisis, to make the transition for a green society, green economy, while the Wall Street consensus is still operating? This is this is the main, because every time that I give a lecture, the people ask me that. ask me about that. Do you think that only with the end of capitalism we will have a green transition? My point of view is not about capitalism or not capitalism. It's about the variety of capitalism. We have in the past some kind of capitalism, the golden age of capitalism that you have is completely different that you have now. So I would like, if you manage to have some thought about that, will be very appreciated. And second, one thing that's very interesting is how are the receptions of the climate justice facility? I know that you are talking about Brazilian Central Bank, UNCTAD, and the other institution. What do you think about that reception for this idea? And if you can talk something about that, and after that I pass for the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and very interesting to know that you were in World Bank and you engaged with all these debates in the past. So my short answer to your question is that no, we cannot have the Wall Street consensus and at the same time to deal with the crisis. But I agree with you that it's very important to take into account that there are different forms of capitalism. There are forms in line with the Wall Street consensus that, in my view, create a lot of problems and a lot of injustices. There are other forms of capitalism that still create inequalities, but not in the same way. And I don't think that we have a very clear answer if we have this broad question, if we can achieve the green transition outside capitalism, because we also need to think about what the system will look like if we don't have capitalism. So I'm not going to go so much into that, but I would like to focus on the fact that, as you said before, we had injustices and we had high inequalities even before climate. And the reason why I talked about the global financial architecture before is due to the fact that the way that the financial system has been organized over the last decades has created a lot of inequalities. And what happens right now with climate is that these inequalities become even worse as a result of the climate crisis. So it's not only about climate. We are working in the system that already generates a lot of inequalities, and the Wall Street consensus has so far been on non-climate issues, and it's already creating a negative impact on many communities on non-climate issues. So we are talking about a structure that is conducive to inequalities, and then we have climate. Now, why is climate for me kind of an important issue, and why I see this as being slightly different compared to what we have seen in the past? It's not that we are having more inequality necessarily with climate. I think that climate creates also some interesting discussions about what system we want to have. Let me give you two examples. One example is my experience with the discussions with central banks. It's the first time that I had the opportunity to talk with people in central banks about what market neutrality means. Market neutrality is a very significant concept for central bankers. And the ECB accepted that market neutrality might not be in line with the climate crisis, because by being market neutral, you make the crisis worse. It would be very difficult to have something like that as part of a discussion in the past. I also have a lot of discussions with central banks in Southeast Asia, whereby fiscal and monetary policy coordination is considered to be something relatively normal. And when we are in rooms where we have central bankers from Europe, and we have the discussion about climate, it's very interesting to see the very different perspectives. But now it's becoming much more difficult, I think, for central banks like the ECB or the Bank of England to defend this separation of fiscal and monetary policy. So climate has created some very interesting discussions about what capitalism we want to have and what forms of capitalism we have that we didn't have in the past. Specifically on climate justice, if we think about structural adjustment programs, this is how IMF call the fiscal austerity in the global south. We have in the past, there was always a kind of an argument that the countries didn't manage to deal with their public finance. They were not responsible enough, and therefore they need to do whatever IMF says. With climate, I have seen a change, which is that nobody can say that we don't have climate injustice. Everyone accepts, because you can see that in the data, that cumulative emissions have come from the global north. And if now, let's say, a country in Africa has to spend more money, this is because they have a hurricane or because they have droughts that are linked with emissions from the global north. Gradually, this is accepted by more people, which means that it's more difficult to say that we are not going to spend money for these climate damages because morally it's a problem of the global south. I think it's the first time that we have an acceptance that a problem, an economic problem that we have in the global south comes from the global north. And of course, this is not right, because if you think about the history of colonialism, many of the challenges in the global south come from colonialism in the global north. But I think it's the first time that it's easier to get a kind of consensus on the fact that there is injustice. And from my perspective, this creates a kind of an opportunity to raise some more fundamental questions. And the reason why I thought about this idea of having a climate justice facility is because now we have a significant injustice in terms of who creates money. We saw that during COVID-19. And in my view, if you ask someone, do you accept climate injustice, and they say yes, it means that they have to do something to deal with that by using their capacity to create money, because they are at the top of the currency hierarchy. So this type of discussion would not be possible 10 or 15 years ago without climate. I think now, when I discuss this with people, it's more difficult for them to say that the idea is bad. Of course, we can have disagreements about what exactly this means for the exchange rates, what exactly this means for inflation. But the fundamental idea that we need somehow to support the global south, I think is the first time that we can have a kind of a broader consensus about that. So this is what makes perhaps climate from that perspective a little bit unique. And let me also say that in terms of money creation, because this is at the core of this idea, what I have highlighted is that losses and damages are increasing exponentially. It's not just to provide some money within a specific year, and we need to have an automatic mechanism. Otherwise, I mean, think about Barbados. They are going to, every year it will become worse. How are they going to deal with that? Is Barbados' problem a problem of the global north? Yes, it is. How can we support them? We need to use whatever it takes to support them, because this is, if you use climate debt as a starting point, this is what it means. Is it just to spend more money for 2 or 3 years? No, it's about spending more money every year. And this is what makes unique this situation. And this is why I think that only through money creation, which already happens and supports the financial system, we can address this challenge. So although it sounds too radical, I think if you look at the reality, this is something that is coming, and we cannot rely on the existing financial mechanisms. And getting back, I'm going to conclude, getting back to your question about the Wall Street consensus, the problem that I have with the Wall Street consensus is that it creates a specific type of capitalism whereby the government actually intervenes, but in order to support the private sector and to reduce risks and increase returns for the private sector. So it's a very different type of government intervention that we have in our mind based on Keynes and so on. And I think it's very important to highlight that. If we continue that way, one of the other points that I mentioned before is that we also lose the opportunity to develop green industrial policies, whereby you think about how systems within the country interact, and you create big plans that require some coordination. If the job of the government is to meet with people from finance and convince them to invest, at the end of the day, you have fragmented projects. I'm not saying that some of them might not be useful to reduce a little bit the emissions or even for creating some employment, but we are losing the big picture and we don't achieve quick changes and we don't make systemic changes that we need if we look carefully and seriously at climate change. So this is why I think that this is not an effective way in any way to think about that. So I think we just need something completely different from that. And let's hope that there will be more appetite for alternative solutions. I think we are having some interesting discussions. So I'm not extremely pessimistic. I am pessimistic, but not so much, because I have seen some recent changes in terms of how people understand the climate crisis. But thank you so much for
Yannis, let's kill my curiosity. Because is a change, as you said, there is the opportunity to change the politics. Wall Street consensus has to change, and you want to think it's in the politics and even inside the financial system. But what you think are the reception of this inside the university, inside the academy? Because as you said before, if there is some myth, the myth of the austerity, the myth of neutrality, and so on. These are theoretical, embedded inside in many universities, in many school of thoughts, and so on and so forth. So, from your perspective, in a place that UK, that is the central of the mainstream thought, what do you think be the reception? What do you think about the possibilities of you have a more open discussion inside the academia, the academics world about because to give up of austerity, give up the neutrality of money, to speak about a creation of money with this have some to be side by side with MMT and so on and so forth. So what do you think what are the climate inside the academia with this discussion?
Very briefly, since you mentioned MMT, actually my proposal is MMT for the Global South, is not for the Global South to create money and face the problem of exchange rate depreciation, but for the Global North to create money and support the Global South. So just going to clarify that. Now, you're very right that we are in an academic environment that in general is too mainstream. In the UK, we have universities whereby economics is discussed in a very open way and in a very pluralist way. I mean, we have SOAS, University of Leeds, University of Greenwich, where people really discuss with open minds. But we also have Cambridge or Oxford or LSE, where economics is taught in a very narrow way. And of course, those economists, those people who become economists and are from these universities, do not necessarily have a very different view from the standard one. However, what I'm seeing right now is that the new generation of economists is slightly more open. I mean, at SOAS is very open, but also in other universities, the new generation understands better the challenges. And when I talk to an economist that is, let's say, my age, about 40 years old, and they have worked in a central bank, they tend to be very conservative. They don't like any idea that departs from market neutrality, inflation targeting, and so on. But when you talk at a young economist, let's say 25 years old, they see the challenge. They see that climate requires something different. And every year that we fail, I think it becomes a little bit clearer. So the young generation, my understanding is that it is much more open to these ideas, and this is my hope. On top of it, I also see significant differences in the global south. And I mean, I worked with BCB for 2 years on climate. I mean, it was at the beginning of the journey on climate. And I mean, they were much more open than people in the ECB or Bundesbank. In Southeast Asia, I do a lot of capacity building there. People are extremely open to ideas about coordination between the government and the central bank and the financial system. They don't understand market neutrality because they think that nothing is neutral at the end of the day with respect to the markets. So I think that we still have the dominant way of thinking in economics, primarily in the US and Europe, primarily for those who are relatively old. And my hope, based on what I have seen so far, is the young generation, and especially those who are in the global south, which I think now are slightly getting a little bit more attention. And at least as far as we work with these regions quite a lot. And I see very different way of thinking there. So this is where my hope might come from. But if you look at the core of economics, I would say that it is still very narrow-minded. And of course, this might be, it's very important because they have most of the power. So this is not changing, unfortunately.
Thank you, Yannis. Now I open for questions. Someone? Let's the students before. Vem aqui, tem que vir aqui. Ah, não, tem microfone. Fala o nome.
Okay, hello. My name is Thais. I'm a master's student here. My question is about the political viability of green finance. From reading your work and hearing you today, it's very clear to me that this is an issue of public policy, right? This is an issue of legislation in all levels of governance. But I am under the impression, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that voters around the globe are not as concerned about climate change at all, right? People are very worried about the economy, about geopolitical issues, about even civil rights issues, right? I was like watching the primary debates on the United States the other day, and climate change is not even up for debate, right? So my question for you is, how do we as researchers do this connection, right? How do we say to the public, how do we say to voters, look, this one issue is the thing that connects everything? Because I feel like this is what is really missing in the public debate. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you.
Yannis, let's take 2 questions, okay? If you're okay.
Yeah, sir.
Next one.
Hello, my name is Fernanda Faria. I'm a lecturer. I used to work with Professor Croco a long time ago. Well, following your question, Thais, my question is, first of all, thank you for your presentation and your work. It's very clear, very important, necessary in order to disseminate the climate just agenda. It was one of the few papers where we can have a good discussion about this agenda. So I used to say well, it's very difficult to have a concrete climate just agenda because one of the problem is, in my opinion, the lack of coordination. In what the sense? We don't have a global South coordination between each country and inside each country as well. It's very difficult to coordinate the policies, as Thais mentioned before. It's very, we don't have a global South, or for example, a Latin American agenda, climate just agenda. We don't have discussion between the policymakers, between the governors. So I think it's a very important point in order to promote a more integrated discussion about it. Thank you, Yannis.
Yannis, let me put something on the Fernanda. You have in the Global South some initiatives that challenge the hegemony of the United States, like BRICS, BRICS Plus, and like the Eurasian, the Silk Road Bell, and so on and so forth. How do you think that these kind of initiatives helps to deal with this kind of coordination from the South and to deal with that?
Thank you. Great questions. I don't have the best answers necessarily, but I'll do my best. So let me start with the point about what is politically viable. And of course, it's a very important one. And I agree that even though the climate crisis is becoming worse, it's still not a very popular issue. And in many countries around the world, actually, we have seen that governments have postponed decisions. The public doesn't care so much. I agree this is a big problem. Now, how can we deal with that? One thing that I would like to highlight is that if you look at the mainstream literature on environmental economics, I think they created a narrative for many decades that the climate transition is costly, because they focused on the fact that we need to have a very high carbon price. Then everyone said, now we have to spend more money on climate, but we don't have enough money because our debt is already very high, and we don't care about climate because in the short run we want to have high employment and so on. And I think this narrative didn't help. Because if you look at alternative heterodox traditions about how we think about this problem, is that, yes, we need to make investment. This investment needs to be financed somehow, but it can also create some positive effects on productivity. It can create more employment. We can find ways to finance this through the public sector, the private sector. We need to have a combination of tools. It's a very different narrative than the narrative that the transition is always will always be bad for the economy. I'm not saying that politicians have a specific perspective on climate because of that, but I think it's a narrative that we created within economics that didn't help the discussions about climate. So if we want to change this narrative, we need to have a narrative that talks about the crisis and how bad it is, but it also has a positive story about the opportunities that we have if we make the transition. And there are ways to suggest policies that at the end of the day will also create employment, might reduce inequalities if they are implemented in a proper way. And you need to create a more positive narrative that would make people happy to support. So I think it's very challenging politically, but we also need to develop narratives that we can easily communicate to people in order to change the perception that climate is not something that we can deal with right now because it's too costly. And now, in terms of coordination among different countries, I think you are very much right, and I didn't have time to explain that also in my presentation, that when I use the term, first of all, Global South, this includes a lot of different countries with many different interests. And of course, this is just a starting point. So we need to highlight the different responsibilities and the different interests, and I think the Global North, Global South distinction is still useful for doing that. But then we also need to make the next step and understand the geopolitical tensions within the Global South, the different types of groups of countries that try to work together, like BRICS, but it's also challenging. So it's a much more complicated picture. Now, I think that all these initiatives within the Global South are necessary, are very good in the sense that they call into question the hegemony of the US, but they also need to be a little bit more strategic whenever this is possible in terms of how to change the power of finance as well, because if you have a very powerful global finance, you need to find ways to develop financial institutions that do not require this global finance to support your country. And I know that there have been a lot of interesting discussions about that as well. So these initiatives are useful, but what I think is also interesting to look at is the experience with the Loss and Damage Fund in the COP negotiations. Because despite the differences within the Global South, many countries agreed on specific issues when it came to opposing some suggestions from the Global North. And at the end of the day, there was a lot of resistance to having the World Bank as a hosting institution of the fund. But there was the Global South was united against this idea, and they also the Global South started the discussion about the Loss and Damage Fund. So despite the differences, it became possible to get something that is very far from being ideal, but it's better than what we had before. So I think that there are two levels. One level is for the Global South to work more together because there are some common interests. And again, the second level, which is a more complicated one, is to find ways to work despite the geopolitical challenges and difference and so on, which is not an easy thing to do. But if you look at the coordination in the Global North and the coordination in the Global South, I mean, the North has so many institutions that try to protect the power of the North, and the South doesn't have that, and this has to stop in order to redistribute power. And my view is that, this is the last thing that I would like to say, is that what I try to do with this paper is to say that I don't want to restrict myself based on what I think is politically feasible, because sometimes we do that and we make some very small, minor political policy suggestions. I thought if we follow some principles, what could be a kind of a more fundamental solution. And sometimes it's useful to do this as well. It's very important to do also the other work, to work with people in order to make some small changes. But it's also important to also not restrict yourself, because we need to have some visions and we need to have some long-run targets. So I see the climate justice facility as a kind of a long-run target if we take climate justice seriously. But the other things that I mentioned, like one size doesn't fit all, climate adaptation projects, mostly for the Global South. I mean, in my discussions with central banks in Southeast Asia, this is always there. I mean, I'm working now with the Reserve Bank of India, and it's very clear that it doesn't work for them if they apply whatever the BIS or the ECB say. And making this distinction between what works for Europe and what works for India is very important. So we need to do that, and I think this is happening, which is very useful. The next steps are more challenging, but I think it's good to have some targets and not to be restricted by what we think is politically feasible. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question? I have two questions here. If someone from that are, se tiver alguém que está aí na online, se quiser participar, dá toque aqui, tá, gente?
Hello, Yannis. My name is Karina. I'm a master degree student here. And, well, we are passing for some problems that now are ongoing in the world. Like, we just passed to a health emergency, and we are still recovering economies for that. And right now we have some conflicts, international conflicts happen, and that it's like a retrocess in the process. In the last years, for example, we had between the fossil fuels, the ones who that have the most valorization between all of the world, like uranium, like petroleum, and some conflicts are emerging because of that. And it causes some kind of retrocess in the process. And Global South has another problem that besides of no coordination and social problems, we have some dependence of technology and science for the North, and somehow this the helps never comes. We can talk about healthy, of vaccines, of researches, and we are going to have the same problem right now. We have we have so many reunions from United Nations and independent institutions, but the money doesn't come to South. It stays somehow trapped in the North. We don't have the coordination, and we kind of alone because we somehow depend on these initiatives and they don't come. So my question is, besides the financial initiatives that we know that it stands too trapped, and some points, energetic transition, so the cars industry, solar energy, but it's not enough. What would be the one main point that would lead to a real coordination and financial from the North to the South? Because we don't, it's like it doesn't have the necessity. It's like, we have technology, we have resources, so if the climate change come, we are prepared for that. We have another sources of energy, we can explore a little more, we can buy air conditioners, and we already have the technology need. So let the South. The South is just are the places where we're going to put our industries to produce the products we need to live well, even in the bad situations. So what would be, in your opinion, based on your studies, some lead point that would really change the key and say, it doesn't matter if it is going to affect South or North. It's going to affect the world, and we are part of the world. What would be this key to really make the money change hands and come to the really needed initiatives from that?
Yannis, one more question before, Tiago.
Hello, Yannis. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for all your work we have studied here. My name is Tiago. I'm a master's student too. And regarding our research agenda on the main role of central banks should play in the transition, do you think the green inflation that would exist with the transition would be a real problem, just like fossil fuels inflations, and the interest rate would be a remedy effective? And these two questions. And should the review of central banks' mandates be discussed based on the climate agenda? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, great questions. So the first one, I think if we're going to think about change, I suppose we all agree that the perspective of the global North is problematic. At the same time, the global North has a power right now. And of course, there are differences between countries, but I'm talking about the North-South division. So the question is, how do you change this power? Because at the end of the day, political power is a driver of most of these decisions. I think one way to do that is to work on some ideas that might challenge this power as time passes. To give you an example, in the UK, in the past, it was very difficult to talk about the colonies and the history of colonization of the UK. Right now, decolonization is discussed in all UK universities. It's not easy not to accept that the British Empire has created a lot of harm to many people. And this has happened because for perhaps 1 or 2 generations, there was a change in the way of thinking about what the UK is and how many problems they have created to the rest of the world. Making progress in terms of ideas, I think, is useful because once you have changed the ideas, it's easier also to achieve a political change. It's not sufficient, but I think it's a very significant requirement if you want to change what is happening in the world. In the case of climate, someone could say that accepting the responsibilities as an idea is also important. This is my argument. Again, it will not be sufficient. And I agree that at the end of the day, you also need to provide a rationale that would convince the global north that they have an incentive to provide financial support to the global south. And the main rationale that has been used so far is related with the idea that we are going to have a lot of climate refugees and migration. And I think the argument has been that if there is no support for the global south in terms of adapting to climate change and dealing with loss and damages, this will create a huge migration crisis around the world. And Europe and US don't want to have something like that. Now, from a, let's say, a moral perspective, I don't like this argument, to be very clear. For me, we need to have our starting point. Justice needs to be the starting point. But if you talk about what might change the perception about what needs to happen, you need to think about things that the global north consider bad for themselves. And I think perhaps we need a combination of those. We need to change ideas, as we have changed how we perceive in some countries the colonial history. We need to change ideas, but we also need to think about how to create some incentives in the global north to provide more support in the global south. And it's not easy, and the world is becoming very complicated. And as you said, there are so many conflicts right now around the world. And at the end of the day, each country thinks about themselves and their own interests. But we have to continue giving this fight. And I think ideas are important in terms of that. So I don't have a very good answer, but I think it's very important to continue fighting for ideas. And very, very interesting questions about greenflation and central banks. I think that greenflation can be a problem if, for instance, we have that suddenly everyone wants to invest in renewables, and then we have initiatives like IRA in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, that simulated an increase in green materials. If we have a lot of demand for green materials and not sufficient supply, this might be a kind of a problem. From my perspective, using, of course, interest rates is not going to resolve the problem because we are talking about the supply side of the economy. Interest rates are supposed to affect the demand side. But if you have a greenflation problem, you have a climateflation problem, you need to look at the supply and use policies that can deal with the problem, for instance, by creating more supply for green minerals. However, just to say that I think this is where there is a risk, because from the global north perspective, having greenflation means that there will be an inflation that they cannot easily control, and this creates an incentive to extract materials at low labor costs. And for me, this is the problem. I don't see an incentive for them to stop to avoid extractivism. I see exactly the opposite incentive. But I don't think that central banks are going to deal with that by using interest rates. In terms of the mandates, I just wanted to say, to briefly explain what happened in the European Central Bank, which I think was interesting, was not ideal, but was interesting. The European Central Bank has a primary mandate and a secondary mandate. The primary mandate is price stability. The secondary mandate includes the support of the EU government policies. And based on the secondary mandate, they said that they need to introduce green criteria in some of their programs in order to support the net zero targets of the EU. And this is a way to introduce climate considerations into the mandate of central banks through the secondary aspect. Now, if you ask me, I would say that given the emergency of the climate crisis, climate should be much more important in the mandates of central banks. And if you look at the mandates of many countries around the world, sustainable development is there. Sustainable development includes basically climate change and other environmental problems. So some central banks already have a way to say that what if they do something more concrete on climate, that this is in line with their mandate. But it's something that is really challenging in the global north. Central banks really don't want to have climate as part of their primary mandate, but I think there's much more flexibility in the global south. And what I sometimes say to those that I meet from central banks in the global south is that there is an opportunity for them to be more innovative on this area compared to the central banks in the global north, because they have more flexibility to introduce tools that the global north central banks don't have. If you think about the Bank of England, the Fed, they really now don't want to introduce climate innovations in what they do because they are afraid of their mandate that is not about climate. So I think there is much more space on that in the global south. In terms of just to say something about the interest rate as a tool, a few weeks ago, I was in Southeast Asia where we had a training on climate change. And at some point I asked them, there were about 30 central bankers in the room from Southeast Asia. And I asked them, if we have climate inflation, okay, inflation that is generated because of climate, do you think that this would be the responsibility only of the central bank? Or do you think that we should also have a coordination between the government and the central bank, because the government can introduce some policies that might be more helpful than the interest rate? And zero said that we don't need the coordination. Everyone said that we need the coordination. But there was a guy from the Bank of England, who was previously at the Bank of England and was part of the committee for this training. And for him, it was like, of course, we don't want to have any coordination, because from his perspective, inflation is a responsibility only of the central bank. So I think it's very interesting to see this different way of thinking about how we deal with inflation. And my view is that things are changing, and central banks really don't want to accept this new reality. And they need to accept at some point that supply side is not something that they can control. So since climate change affects primarily the supply side of the economy, the interest rate is becoming less relevant. And they have to face that at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Yannis. More questions? I think... No, Yannis, thank you very much.
I have a question.
Okay, Juliana,
please.
Sorry, Juliana. You deserve.
Are you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yannis, thank you so much. It's always good to hear you. And my question is a short question. If I understood well, a part of your presentation, that you said that countries in the global south cannot rely only on national policies. What's the meaning of that? Is about the importance to have a coordination among countries that face similar impacts of climate change, is something like that? And what kinds of national policies is that? Monetary policies, fiscal policies? Thank you so much.
Thanks for asking that. So the main reason why I said that is because there is a lot of space for governments to introduce national policies to support the transition and climate adaptation. But it's very important to highlight that since climate change is not basically their responsibility, they also are at the bottom of the global financial architecture. it's important to always highlight that we also need policies that have to do with how the global north supports the global south. And the reason why I wanted to say that is that I have seen in many cases that people from the global north, experts who support governments or institutions in the global south, they always try to use this one-size-fits-all, and they tell them, you can do this, you can implement this policy, we also use this type of policy in our country, and it can work well for you. And first of all, the context is very different, so it's not necessarily correct that this policy will work in the same way in a country in the global south. But more crucially, if we accept that there's possibility of a government or a central bank or another public authority to deal nationally with the problem of climate change, which is a global one, I think this is not a good starting point. Now, of course, national policies need also to be implemented, and they have a significant role to play. In the case of finance, we can think of having national development banks that try to support the climate transition. We need to develop taxonomies. I know that now in Brazil there is a very interesting discussion about the sustainable taxonomies. We need to have perhaps regulations about finance with respect to deforestation, but also with respect to emissions. So all these national policies, including the broader government policies, of course, are very important, but they will not be sufficient because of what I said before. This is why I wanted to highlight that we shouldn't focus only on national policies. But if you look at the UK, UK has a responsibility as a country to reduce emissions quickly, and they have the capacity to do that, and they have to do this based mostly on national policies. The global south is not the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that you could 1 hour and a half, Yannis. I think you are very tired now. And thank you very much, Yannis, for the opportunity to talk with you. For us, it's very important. I think it's very important to the view that, because at the end of the day, you don't discuss only the climate change, but you discuss political economy at the end of the discussion, the day, which is very important for us. And I'd like to take the opportunity, in every 2 years, our center here in the last 40 years, so we're going to the 20. Every 2 years, we go to all the center, the professors and the students go to one of the most historical cities of Minas Gerais, which is Diamantina, and make a seminar, a conference. It started 40 years ago as an internal seminar of the department, of the center, only the professor. Nowadays, is about a conference about 600 people from everywhere in Brazil, especially from Minas Gerais. It's a very beautiful place. And next year in August, we will have the 20th conference of Diamantina. And I will invite you, so if you don't have plans for your vacation in next August, so you receive a formal invitation for us to come here and have a talk presentially in a very nice place, okay? So if you don't have plans for next vacation, next holidays in UK, so please, I make a reserve some date, okay? The invitation follows.
Thank you so much. It would be a very great pleasure for me to do that. I need to check what I have in August. It's not only my vacation, it's also that I have this project with India, and I might need to go there. But thank you so much. I would be grateful to come, and let's check the details. Mm-hmm. But thank you so much, and a great pleasure to talk to all of you, and thanks for the great questions. And yes, I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Yannis. I send you the details, the formal invitation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.